All right, Dominaria United launches in about a week on Arena, so we're going to go through some of the archetypes, synergies, and big picture ideas of the set for Limited. So let's get started. There's going to be 3 major mechanics in the set, and we're starting off with Enlist. This is a new mechanic, a new take on banding. It's kind of a confusing one, but they did their best to clean up banding. So Enlist creatures read, as the creature attacks, as the creature with Enlist attacks, you may tap a non-attacking a creature you control without summoning Sickness. When you do, you add its power to this creature's until end of turn. So it doesn't help the creature with toughness, so they can still, if you tap a 2/2 with Guardian of New Benalia, Guardian of New Benalia becomes a 4/2. It can still get blocked by a 2/2 and trade off. But it does help some of your Enlist creatures trade up if you're in that situation. You do have to but tap one of your creatures that doesn't have summoning sickness, so it is a little bit slower of a mechanic. There are places and situations where I think this mechanic can be useful, but on the whole, I don't think it's going to be a huge factor in the set, but of course we'll have to see once it launches. Up next is something we know that's going to be a factor. One of the best mechanics ever, Kicker returns. So all of the kicker cards in this set are off-color kicker cards. So they are all multicolor, like our Lurgoyf reprint here. Some are going to be 2-color kicker. The rares are going to be these 3-color kickers, but there's commons and uncommons that are multicolor kicker as well. And they just, you can cast the card on its face, and if you play kicker, you get a little ETB bonus something when it comes into play. It gives you an extra effect. You're going to see these on creatures, instant sorceries, you name it. Next up is another returning mechanic called Domain, and this depends on how many basic land types you have under your control. So there's a cycle of dual lands in this set that are 2 basic land types. They count as 2 basic land types. If I have 1 forest, 1 plains, that's 2 as well. If I have 2 forests, that's 1 for the domain count. Of course, you can max out at 5. It tends to be that domain cards are acceptable if mediocre at 2, and they start to become good at 3 and great at 4 and 5. There's a few others that you're going to see. Read Ahead is going to be on our sagas, and all that is you can choose which chapter you start at. You still sacrifice the saga after reading chapter 3, but you can choose to skip all the way to the 2nd or 3rd chapter when it ETBs. Up next, we have Stun. This is going to be a new evergreen mechanic. I really, really like this mechanic. I hope it works out. But this replaces the Frostlinks type ability in blue, where instead of saying tap a creature, it doesn't untap during its next untap step, you just put a stun counter on it, and whenever that creature would untap, due to its untap step or some other effect that untaps creatures, instead of untapping it, you remove a stun counter. And then the last one is just on 2 cards. Don't really need to worry about this. It's going to come up in later sets. You can see it on Karn here. It's called Power Stone. These Power Stone tokens tap to add mana that can be played for artifact spells, or for non-artifact, and they can't be played, on non-artifact spells. So you can use them for abilities or artifact spells, but don't draft Karn unless you really need this for some sort of deck. It's just not good, and the Power Stones aren't going to be a factor in this set, so you don't really have to worry about that mechanic. In the draft, because this is a multicolor format and because these off-color kicker cards are so powerful, it's going to be very, very important for you to find the open lane. This set seems to be driven by uncommon power level. There are, of course, some busted rares and mythics like in every set, but in this set in particular, I've noticed that the uncommons are quite powerful. So you're going to want to try to find that open lane so you can wheel some of those more powerful off-color kicker cards like Battlewind Mystic, which is great in a blue-red deck, a cheap flyer. But if you're blue-white or blue-green or blue-black, you're not really going to want to splash for red for this effect. But for your blue-red aggressive spells deck, this might be a very good card. Next up is Keep It Cheap. A lot of the cards here in this set have a magic number of 3 toughness or less. So you want to keep your removal cheap. It looks like it's going to be a somewhat aggressive set, at least at first blush. Of course, we'll see as soon as the set drops. But it's better, of course, to draft 1, 2, 3 drop creatures and then your cheap removal to start, and then fill out the rest of the deck with your more expensive spells if you need them. Kicker makes this very easy because kicker cards start off cheap, and then you can pay the kicker cost for added effects. And then lastly, if we're going Domain in this set, I think Domain wants you to go all in. Domain seems to be a base green, all-in type mechanic. It's what green wants to do. It's the thing that green is good at doing. I don't know if green's good at doing other things. So if you're going Domain, draft lands highly and draft Domain cards highly. You can splash around in that deck, in the Domain deck, and try to make your cards a little bit more busto. All right. On to the colors themselves. So White's theme is going to be go wide and tokens. I love this card. I think Resolute Reinforcements is going to be huge for White. It's a 1/1 flash. When it ETBs, you make a little 1/1 White Soldier creature token for 2 mana. Just a very good on-rate creature. It can be used as a trick to block a 2/1, or it can be used with your payoffs in green-white or red-white, your aggressive go wide type decks. Even blue-white can make use of this. It does have some battlefield pump effects as well. Next up, we have our big value creature here. This card is amazing at uncommon. 2 mana, 2/3 lifelink is already good, but when you put the kicker in, it becomes a little gravedigger as well. Just great value on a great rate. Perfect 2-for-1. If you're in white-black, draft it. If you're playing green-white or green-black, you can splash it. Just a fantastic card. Another thing I noticed in this set is it's kind of oops all O-rings. There's 4 different O-ring effects in the set. Seems like Wizards got the memo that pacifism isn't very good anymore, and so they made an O-ring at common, 1 at uncommon, and 1 at rare, 2 at rare, and including like a battlefield or battle-wide O-ring for creatures with CMC 2 or less. So O-rings, of course, are very strong. There are just a couple incidental enchantment removal spells in the set. One I don't think is going to be played in white, and then there's a very good green in common that can exile artifacts and enchantments, so I think your O-rings are going to be pretty safe. Into the top commons, my first up is going to be Argivian Cavalier. Because white wants to go wide here, it's a 2/2 for 3 with Enlist, and you get a 1/1 white soldier creature token, so this attacks as a 3/2 just by itself. And then you get 2 bodies for the price of 1. That 1/1 is not irrelevant in any white deck with all the pump effects that they have, ways to put counters on things. Just fits fantastic in the sacrifice deck in white-black. Just has a home everywhere for every white deck. I think this card is super solid in the best white common. Up next, this is going to be hard to cast. I'm not sure if this is going to be the second best white common because it has 2 pips of white. And you might, that's kind of a restrictive cost, but O-ring is O-ring, and so I got to keep it up there. It is a 3 mana removal spell that's still cheap, where you're not going to be trading down on mana for this. It doesn't work on enchantments or artifacts, but it does take out creatures, and if your opponent slams a planeswalker, you can deal with that too. Next up, this is kind of a hot take here as well, but I really, really like this trick. Take up the shield. I think every white deck is going to want a copy of this, maybe 2. It gives your creature a +1/+1 counter, lifelink, and indestructible. So that saves it from removal. It helps you win races. It leaves behind a counter, all for the cost of 2 mana. I think when you're playing against a white deck, you always have to be aware of this card as well. There's not a lot of instant speed -X spells in this set. It's more damaged based. So I think this card is going to be very, very strong and hard to blow out as long as you play it appropriately. All right, blue is up next. So this is going to be the spells matter color. Really, really love Micromancer with all the kicker spells. In this format, it's 4 mana for a 3/3, so you get a Hill Giant, and then you can go search for an instant or sorcery with mana value 1. There's a number of very, very strong 1 mana instants and sorceries in this set that have kickers that make them very, very powerful that we're going to talk through as well. So I think this card is just a straight up 2-for-1. It can go find some of the better spells in your deck, and it's a relevant body that has to be dealt with or that can trade. And we get Bergstrider back. A little bit harder to cast, but it's a 5 mana for a 4/4 ward 2, so a little upgrade there, and then it taps down an opponent's creature. Blue does seem to be a little bit more aggressive in this set than we're used to, so I think this is going to be even better here. because you're going to want to be beating down. And of course, the Striders are usually better on offense. Last up, here is one of those removal spells that you can go grab with Micromancer. Rona's Vortex is a single blue instant speed with a kicker of 2 and a black. And then you bounce a creature you don't control. So it's just a bounce spell on its face for a single blue, which is fine. If it's kicked, you put the permanent, and it's a creature or planeswalker, so it doesn't hit artifacts and enchantments, but you put the permanent on the bottom of its owner's library instead, which is better than putting it in the graveyard because your opponent's never going to see it again. It's effectively removed from the game at that point. So I think this card is incredibly efficient, good removal at instant speed, gets around all tricks, and then effectively removes whatever you want gone. And there's also some tokens and stuff in this set as well. So you can always bounce a token and get rid of something that way, or use it as a tempo play. Very, very flexible card. All right, up next, top commons. Again, this is going to be very contextual here. I'm not sold on Tolarian Geyser as the top common here. It might be Essence Scatter. There's a couple others that blue has. I think blue is very deep, but there's not a lot of great creatures, cheap creatures that I really want in my deck. So difficult color to evaluate, but I do think the color is one of the stronger ones in the format. Tolarian Geyser, 3 mana, bounce a creature, draw a card. If you pay the kicker cost, you also gain 3 life. The downside of this, and it is a pretty big downside with any bounce spell, is that it's sorcery speed. What this card does, if we know blue is going to be aggressive though, or try to race, is that it can get you ahead in the race. You can use it on offense to get rid of a blocker and get in there for some damage. Blue is going to have a ton of Spells Matter cards as well, prowess type creatures if you're blue-red, that are going to care about you casting spells. Up next, one of those cards that cares about you having spells in your yard is going to be Tolarian Terror. On its face, it looks terrible. 7/7 for a 7 mana for a 5/5 Ward 2. But there's a ton of cheap spells in blue, and if you go blue-white or blue-red, they're just hanging out everywhere. And so you can get this thing down to 4 mana pretty quickly. And 4 mana for a 5/5 Ward 2 is a good rate. It's difficult to remove. The Ward 2 does matter. So I think you're going to want to get these in any spells deck, and any spells deck is going to want blue in it. And then lastly, this could have been a lot of cards as well, but Essence Scatter is back. This is just a very efficient counter spell for 1 and a blue, and we know that blue cares about casting spells, so being able to do this can definitely help your deck out in other ways and synergize with your deck. So I think Essence Scatter is going to be a high pick as well. You don't want to overload on these. Your deck is usually going to want 1 or 2 just to deal with a bomb or some creature, or later or in the mid game you can counter something that's going to cause you some trouble. Or if you don't have a good play on turn 2, you just hold up the mana and counter their 2-drop. On to black. So we have Enter the Battlefield Recursion. Black is going to care about the graveyard, right? So Belduvian Atrocity, it's a 3 mana, 2/3 menace, not great stats, but if you pay the kicker cost, you can return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your yard to the battlefield. It gains haste, swing it into your opponent. Essentially, it gets blitzed in, and then if you have some sacrifice fodder, something like that, Bone Splinters is in the set, for example, you can use that. If it has an ETB effect, that's really good as well. So flexible card, ETB recursion. Black has some self-mill synergies, so there's lots of different things you can do with Belduvian Atrocity. And then you got to have the sack fodder as well if you're going to get stuff in the yard. Cult Conscript, I think, is a great one at uncommon. It's a 1 mana, 2/1, so it is aggressive. It ETB's tap, but it can trade off, trade up. And then you don't really care if it dies, because anytime a non-skeleton creature dies, you can get it back from the graveyard to the battlefield for just 2 mana. And then lastly, we have some cheap removal. I think Cut Down probably looks better than it is. But I think in a set with so many cheap creatures, it's still very good. 1 mana, instant speed, destroy a creature with power and toughness 5 or less. Total power and toughness. So kill an 0/5, a 1/4, a 3/2, but not a 3/3 or a 2/4. Into the comments. So first up, we have Phyrexian Ranger. A classic card is back. I do think this is the best black common. 3 mana for a 2/2, draw a card, lose a life when it ETBs. Perfect to get back with your Belduvian Atrocity. Draw more cards. Everybody loves that. And then it trades off, trades up. Your opponent's not going to want to use removal on it because you already drew your card off of it. Think of it as a Priest of Ancient Lore, but maybe slightly worse. But it's still very good. Extinguish the Light is up next. This is going to be our unconditional black removal spell that we always have. 4 mana, destroy a creature or planeswalker. It is instant speed, which is huge. It does have 2 pips of black, which is a downside. But if you have to fire this off because you're getting beat down by an aggro deck, you got to fire it off at a cheap creature, mana value 3 or less. You gain 3 life, so it's not so much of a feels bad. And if you're ever doing that to take out a cheap creature, you probably really need to do that. And so the life gain could help you stabilize. And then lastly, we have Tribute to Urborg. This could have been a couple others, but black seemed pretty thin at common. This is another instant speed removal spell here. 2 mana, -2/-2 until end of turn to a creature. And then if you pay 1 in a blue, it gets an additional -1/-1 for each instant and sorcery in your yard. Blue-black is the deck that care about spells being in the graveyard, so there is some synergy there and some reason that you would have a bunch of stuff in the yard. So towards the end game, this can really delete creatures, and there's nothing your opponent can do to save them, but then you're paying 4 mana for this, and then you have to jump through a couple hoops to be able to do that and be in the blue-black deck. So it can be tough to get that kicker to really make a difference. All right, up next we have red. So we get some 2-for-1 removal, which is always welcome. Fires of Victory. This card, we had a similar card to this way back in Tarkir, Khans of Tarkir, which was very good. We'll see how it works here, but it's 2 mana to deal damage to a creature or planeswalker, equal number of cards in your hand, and if you kick it, you get to draw a card first. And then so that adds to the damage there. So 2-for-1 removal, always good. It is instant speed as well. So I think this is going to have a place in any blue-red spells deck. Gives you velocity, some damage, gets a blocker out of the way. What's not to love? Well, you can always love this 2-drop. Electrostatic Infantry, I think, is going to be one of the stronger uncommons in the set. It's 2 mana for a 1/2 trample, but every time you cast an instant or sorcery, it gets a counter, which is huge. This thing can get out of control. Your opponent has to answer it. In that blue-red spells deck, or even red-white, I think, can have a lot of battlefield pump. This card can just go insane. So really, really like this 2-drop. And then we have Zenith Player at Home. 3 mana to deal 4 to a creature or planeswalker at instant speed, which is already good. But if you can kick it, if you're in the red-white deck, you gain 4 life as well. So kind of Lightning Helixy Zenith Player vibes. It does not go face, but still very good. All right, on to the top commons in red. I think one of the top commons in the set is going to be Lightning Strike. So 2 mana instant speed, deals 3 damage to any target. It can go face, it can nug an opponent. Of course, you're going to use it mostly on creatures, but incredibly efficient instant speed removal that you always got to watch out for. It sets the standard for toughness in creatures in the set at above 3. So anything below 3, and there's a lot that are 3 or below. A lot of the signpost and commons have 3 toughness or less. This thing's just going to get rid of them. So I think Lightning Strike is going to be maybe your top common in the set. Just a very strong first pickable card. One of the other top commons in the set, this card is amazing to me. It's 2 mana for a 1/2, and then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So it can be an efficient beater, especially with all the instant speed stuff in red and blue. If you're going that route, that is the spells deck. So your opponent effectively can't block it unless they have some creature that they don't care about that's going to trade. If they have a creature that they care about and you have a couple of instant spells, it trades way up. Even on defense, if you have instant speed stuff, this thing can trade way up. It's very strong, and it has kicker. And if you kick it, it bounces a creature back to your opponent's hand. So I think this card is incredibly powerful. Would also be happy if blue-red is, where I'm at, first picking this out of pack 2 or something. So I think this card is very strong. Last up, there's a lot of different options here in red I could have chose. Kind of went on a little bit of a tangent here. Maybe this is a hot take. But Flowstone Infusion, it's cheap, it's instant speed, and there's a lot of creatures that have 2 toughness or less in this set. So target creature gets +2/-2 until end of turn. It's instant speed. They took this effect from black. Last time we've seen it was in Strixhaven. I think it was called Lash of Malice. And Lash of Malice was very good in that set. So I believe Flowstone Infusion does also have the potential to be good here as well. But I think red's a pretty deep color, and it fits in a lot of decks pretty well. It's very aggressive, so there could be a lot of competition for that 3rd best common. And we have green. So Green is all about domain, and it has some great beaters in domain if you can do the thing, which is all green really wants to do. So Neshoba Brawler, 2 mana, star 3, trample, and its power is equal to the number of basic land types you control. Green can get to 3 land types pretty quick, so this is effectively reads, if you're doing the thing, a 3/3 trample for 2 mana, which is a great 2-drop. That is amazing as a 2-drop, with only upside from there. Then we have another aggro 2-drop here, Yavimaya Iconoclast, one of the stronger uncommons in the set, I believe. 3/2 trample for 2 is already a great rate. You're already swinging for the fences here. But when you kick it, it becomes a 4/3 haste trample until end of turn. I think a lot of games are going to end by a kicked Yavimaya Iconoclast. And then last up, black has access to some strong removal here out of uncommon. Terra Sunder, 2 mana to exile an artifact or enchantment. That's not very good. That's just a upside naturalize. But if you kick it, it becomes exile target non-land permanent. That means it can go after everything that creature, planeswalker, enchantment, or artifact, of course. So very strong instant speed removal in Terra Sunder if you're doing the Golgari thing. But even if not, green wants to do the domain thing, and you might consider splashing black for this effect. On to the commons. I'm not too happy with the green commons. I think there's a place for them. I think the domain commons, I'm going to wait and see on how powerful they are. But first up, we have Vineshaper Prodigy. This is Organ Hoarder at home. 2 mana for a 2/2, so you can play it as a Grizzly Bear, but if you kick it for 1 and a blue, you look at the top 3 cards in your library, you put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom. Why this is worse than Organ Hoarder is that those cards don't go into the yard. And in Organ Hoarder's case, in Midnight Hunt, you can flip Disturb cards or Flashback cards into the yard and essentially get multiple card draws out of the thing. It also was a 3/2, of course, and then it had relevant types as a zombie. This doesn't have any of that, but I still think it's quite strong in green, especially if you're in the green-blue deck. I don't know if I would want to splash this common if I'm like green-red or green-white or green-black or something. Next up, we have Bite Down. This is instant speed, Rabid Bite. These effects usually are a lot worse than they look, but it is instant speed. It's 2 mana, and it's a bite, not a fight. So considering the state of green's commons, which we'll have to see more of, I think I'm going to put this one at the second best, just to give green some interaction there. And then last, we have Floriferous Vinewall. This is another hot take here, but it's 2 mana for an 0/2 defender. Not great, but when it ETBs, you can look at the top 6 of your library and grab a basic land. So this is doing that domain thing, like I think green wants to do, where it wants to go all in on domain to make the most out of its domain cards. And Floriferous Vinewall makes that happen. So I'm going to put that as the other top. It also helps you hit your 3rd land drop. It makes if you're keeping a 2-lander much easier on the play. If you have a bunch of expensive green cards and Floriferous Vinewall, of course, it does not block very well. Almost everything in this set has 2 power or more. There's very few 1/1s or 1/2s or 1/3s that are trying to attack in. So if this was an 0/3, I would say that this is a solid card. As such, we'll just have to see how it goes. All right, and then there's some colorless. So we talked about the domain duels. So these are tap land, dual lands that have 2 basic land types. These are going to be critical for that all-in domain deck that you're going to want to pick up. Not as well, maybe as many as you can for domain. Maybe 5 or 6 are going to be good and splash around. Next up, Meteorite. If you are splashing, but maybe not heavy domain, there is some value in Meteorite. The card does look clunky. It is clunky, but considering the state of artifacts in this set, which are not heavily pushed, which are not very well supported, I think that this card might have a place in some decks. If you're really trying to splash an off-color bomb, or you need a lot of double pips, or if you're low on interaction, it can ping a creature and then accelerate you to 7 for your big kicker spells. Lastly, wanted to touch on this super quick, is the Defender deck. This Defender deck is seeded at mainly uncommon in the format. A lot of the Defenders are very unimpressive. There are none in red. There's just the one Floriferous Vinewall in green, so this is primarily in the Esper colors. I think this type of deck might come together once every 20 drafts, but if it does, I really want to try it. Walking Bulwark makes your defenders able to attack. Wingmantle Chaplain, if you have a critical mass of defenders, is going to give you a bunch of flying birds to go beat up your opponent with. And then cards like Blight Pile are just going to act as Vine Sentinels, if you remember Rise of the Eldrazi, and just nug your opponent over and over. There's a couple more in black that seem like they might have a place. One that allows you to sacrifice creatures. There's a couple in blue, which cares about you. One which cares about you casting instants and sorceries, and one which mills your opponent. We'll just have to see how it all shakes out. All right, on to the color rankings here. Just to start, of course, these can change before we draft the set. First off, I have red. It has efficient removal, good top-end commons, and uncommons seem strong. And I think that all of the decks that red goes in seem to be viable. I think white-red seems like a very strong aggressive deck. Red-blue is my pick for the top deck in the format, just to start. Red-green, the Domain Beatdown deck, I think can splash around and has some options there. And then red-black is, I think, the best venue for black is the red-black sack deck. Next up, we have white. It has O-Rings All Day, which is decent removal. They are a little bit expensive, but it's still very good unconditional removal for white to have at common. And then there's some other powerful top-end commons like Argivian Cavalier. And then it has a really, really strong tokens theme that's going to interfere a lot with non-evasive creatures. It has Battlefield Pump to help get those tokens in, trade off, trade up, or kill your opponent with. Up next, we have blue. So it has efficient, very cheap spells for synergy, really, really good kicker cards, and great uncommons like Micromancer to help you power through and get 2-for-1s and card advantage. I think blue is very strong. The issue I have with blue is that there's not a lot of creatures at common that I really want to play, especially cheap ones. So turns 1 through 3, I'm not really sure what I'm doing other than playing my unkicked cheap spells. Which you don't necessarily want to do if I'm trying to play blue commons. Up next, we have green. So poor commons in general, unless you can get the domain thing going. So it seems to be like, instead of this having 4 archetypes, with green, white, green, blue, green, red, green, black, it seems to be like you want to be main green domain, or just have green as a minor support color. And then last up, we have black here. The removal is kind of expensive. The creatures are pretty poor. Other than Phyrexian Rager, I'm not sure what I'd want to play. There's a 3-mana 3/1 that self-mills, and then you can pay 5 to get it out of the to exile it from the yard and bring a creature back from your graveyard to your hand. That card seems fine, but that other than that, I'm just not sure really what I want to be playing out of black for creatures. And then the removal is kind of clunky and expensive. 4-mana instant speed and 2-mana instant speed removal spells. The 4-mana is kind of clunky on mana value, and then the 2-mana one only gives -2/-2. So we'll have to see how it shakes out. But right now I have black as bringing up the rear. Everything does seem viable so far, but all right, into archetypes. So Azorius is going to be go wide with tokens, and instants and sorceries matter. So you're going to see the blue-white kicker cards or white-blue kicker cards. The off-color, multicolor ones take prominence here. I think Protect the Negotiators is going to be good in this deck. It's counter-target spell, any spell, and then you're going to have a bunch of go-wide tokens. If you kick it, you get an extra soldier creature token. So I think this card is going to be viable in that deck. And then each color pair is going to get 2 Signpost uncommons. Wrath here, I think, is incredibly powerful. 2 mana for a 1/3. Whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery spell, you can tap a couple creatures you control and draw a card. So that turns Protect the Negotiators here into a straight-up cantrip, which is amazing, right? And then it also does Battlefield Pump. It gives you that Steadfast Unicorn ability from Horizons Baldur's Gate. You do pay an extra mana for it, but it's still very, very strong. 5 mana, creatures you control gain Vigilance, and +1/+1 until end of turn. Vigilance being a very powerful ability, especially if you're go wide, because you're leaving all your creatures back to block too. And then we have Tura Kanurud, Sky Knight, and I'm not pronouncing that correct. I apologize. 5 mana for a 3/3 flyer, which is medium on rate. It does have the double pip of blue, which is tough, but there's a huge upside here. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get a free token. So this can get out of control very quickly. You can get a lot of velocity in blue with card draw on your spells and just build up a massive board. So this creature, of course, Both the uncommons can be taken out by lightning strike, which is a problem, but if they stick around, they can take over a game. Some of the synergy pieces you're going to get, Tillarian Geyser, we talked about this one before. I think is going to be very strong in this deck. You're going to be able to kick it, help win races. Runic Shot might have a place in this deck. It's because it's super cheap, and you're going to be able to scry too. Now, typically this effect isn't the best because of vigilance, or the creature that's attacking you is already going to be able to get in. And this is also sorcery speed, but I think the cheap part of this is what makes it strong here. It's just 1 white mana to destroy a tapped creature, and then you can kick it in scry 2. If you have your payoffs in place for instants and sorcerers, I think this card has a place in white-blue. And then last up, Stall for Time. Love this card. Almost put this on the top white commons, but I really love these stun counters. 3 mana to tap 2 creatures and draw a card, which is already fine. If you kick it, they each get a stun counter and don't untap. This is instant speed as well, so this really shuts down your opponent's blockers. If they're leaving stuff back to block your tokens, you can tap 2 things down and get in for a big attack with Wrath or something. Up next, we have the Domain Go Wide. I think this is going to be mostly a white deck with green for support, and you're going to use those white token creators to and also take advantage of some of the green pump effects like Strength of the Coalition here, which I think is going to be one of the best tricks in the format. Instant speed, green to give a creature +2/+2, but when you kick it for the extra 3, each of your creatures get a +1/+1 counter. So including the one you got +2/+2 will also get another counter on it, as well as your huge board of tokens at instant speed can kill your opponent out of nowhere, destroy them in combat. I mean, this card is very strong. You do have to be careful not to cast this into open mana, though. The Signpost in commons, I think Queen Alenal of Rodok. I don't know why they use any of those words. So hard to pronounce. 3 mana for a star, and it's equal to the number of creatures you control, so this is going to get huge later in the game. And then if 1 or more creature tokens would be created, you get an extra soldier token instead, and that is what this deck really wants to do. So I think this card is going to be super strong in the deck. And then next up, I'm not sure on this one. I think at the very least, though, it's going to pump up your tokens, which is fine. It's a 4/4 for 5, which isn't great, but whenever it becomes tapped, each creature with toughness less than the number of basic land types you control gets a 1/1 counter. So you're going to have at least 2 basic land types in play. So when this thing gets tapped to attack or tapped to enlist something, it's going to buff all your creatures, and that can be strong. Battlefield Pump is always good. Some of the synergy pieces here. Captain's Call. This looks pretty unassuming. I think this also has a good place in the white-blue deck. 4 mana, sorcery speed, but you get 3 soldier creature tokens. Or 4 if you have that Queen Analak in play. Resolute Reinforcements, we talked about this one. I think this card is going to be at its best in green-white. And the reason for that is because we have Griffin Protector. And I think this card is going to be strong in this deck in particular. It might have a home in blue-white, but I think mainly you're going to want this in white-green. 4 mana for a 2/3 flyer is not great, but if you're putting 2/3 creatures into play every turn, this thing gets out of control. If you can do that at instant speed with Resolute Reinforcements, this becomes a 4/5 at instant speed. It can really screw up math combat for your opponent, and so I think this card can beat down real hard in this type of deck. All right. Orzhov. So this is go wide and sacrifice. So now we're sacrificing our tokens for value. Phyrexian Warhorse is a common in black. Again, the creatures in black aren't great, but this one I think has a place in this deck. A 3/3 and a 1/1 for 5 mana isn't the worst on rate, and then you can sacrifice some of your tokens at instant speed, as many as you want, to buff the Warhorse. And that can make this thing either a must block for your opponent because it's going to kill him out of nowhere, or it can just trade up or trade around. The uncommons are what I think save this deck, and they're very strong, Aaron being the strongest of them. 2 white and a black for a 3/3 menace, which is already really, really good. You can sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That is huge. And you can do this at instant speed. You can do this in response to removal to get value off of your creature. If your opponent targets Aaron with Lightning Strike, you can sack another creature to make it a 4/4. Just incredibly powerful. Up next is Ellis Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim. 2 mana, 2/2 Death Touch, which is already fine. It also has the Soul Warden ability and the Blood Artist or Blood Artist type ability on the backside here. Whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. Since you're going to be sacrificing a ton of creatures, making a ton of tokens, this card can be very strong as well. And it always can trade up as a 2/2 Death Touch for 2 mana. I do think this deck is a little clunky, though. All right, Resolute Reinforcements. You keep seeing this one pop up, but of course, very, very good in this deck as well. Gibbering Barricade. So we talked about the Defenders deck a little bit. I think the only home for this card might be in this deck, where you can sacrifice a creature to gain a life. Draw a card. It does seem pretty clunky, but it's a 2/4. This deck looks like it wants to grind people out with its strong uncommons, with draining, with getting value off their sacrificing. So I think this card has a place. And then guess what? Captain's Call's back as well. So this gives you a bunch of sack fodder for Aaron or your Warhorse, a bunch of fodder to drain your opponent with, and it also gains you some life if you have your Sadistic Pilgrim signpost in place. All right, Boros. So this is aggro, baby. Go wide. Get some combat tricks. And guess what? Are we surprised? This is what we always do in Boros. So Heroic Charge I like quite a bit. You don't even need to kick this, but if you can, it's a great bonus. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. And then they also get Trample if it was kicked. Great way to end a game of Magic. The Signpost. Tori, the Davenant Fury Rider. 4 mana for a 3/3 Vigilance Trample, which is fine. Whenever it attacks, all other attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. That is massive. Other red attacking creatures get Trample, and then other white attacking creatures untap, so they effectively get Vigilance. This is huge, and makes every attack incredibly dangerous for your opponent whenever this thing can get in. You just got to be able to protect this. Next up, Baird, I think, is also incredibly busted. If you can drop this on turn 2 and get this thing rolling, it becomes unstoppable. It's a 2/2. It's a Grizzly Bear, 2/2 for 2. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Now this works within list, but basically you're just going to want it like a 3/2 or a 2/1 or a 4/3 or something to trigger this every turn and not have to worry about it. But it becomes incredibly powerful if it can get going. Just watch out for removal. All right. I think this card is going to have a place as well. Phoenix Chick. You have to find a way to get this into your graveyard because your opponent can ignore it. So either discard it or your opponent eventually is going to have to block it, I guess. There's different sacrifice outlets in red specifically that you can use. But it's a flying haste 1/1 that can ping. Can't block, which is a big problem because your opponent can ignore it. But when you attack with 3 or more creatures, you can play double red and then get it back from the yard, tapped and attacking with a counter on it. And then it becomes a 2/2 flying haste. And that is pretty strong. Your opponent can't really ignore that for very long. Up next, Cleaving Skyrider. I'm not sure how good this one's going to be because it's so expensive with the kicker, and you're going to want to kick this. A 2/2 Flash Flyer is fine. That's just a fine card. But you really want to be able to kick this to get a blocker out of the way. So it deals X damage when it's kicked, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So you can get a blocker out of the way, enable attacks, and add to the board all at the same time. And then last up, again, we're going to have to see how this one fits in. But Keldon Strike Team for 5 mana is going to add 3 attackers to the board with haste, if you can kick it. If not, a 3 mana haste 3/1 is not good. But if you have a clear lane to attack, you know you're going to be on the beatdown, you know you're aggressive, you can cast it without kicker for a pinch, in a pinch. All right, Dimir. I think this one is very clunky, but we're going to have to see how it all works. So this is going to be instants and sorceries in the graveyard strategy. So we talked about Tribute to Urborg. This is the home, I think, for this card because you're going to have a bunch of instants and sorceries in the yard. And the Signposts and commons kind of drive you to that. So Rona here, 4 mana for a 3/4. 4 toughness is good. It avoids Lightning Strike. And then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you don't drain the opponent, they lose a life. This does have some form of recursion late game. So you can return it, or you can cast it by discarding 2 cards from your hand in addition to paying the 4 mana. So that's not going to come up too often. Maybe late game. This is going to be a grindy deck. You can get your 3/4 back. And then next up, Vohar is a good little Merfolk looter. It's 2 mana for a 1/2. Draw a discard for free. And then if you discard an instant or sorcery, you drain your opponent. I don't think you're going to be discarding instants and sorceries too much because you're really going to want to cast those. But if you do, if you're land screwed or something, or you have a really great hand, you can do that. And then you can sacrifice it for 2 mana to be able to cast an instant or sorcery from your yard that turn. So it does have late game value, more late game value as well. Merfolk looters tend to gain value as the time goes on because you can filter unwanted lands. So I'm not sure how often you're going to be doing this, but you can do it during your turn as a sorcery if you really need to cast that card out of your yard. Some of the synergy pieces. Tillarian Terror, we talked about this one as well, but this is going to be the best home for it, although I think any blue deck is going to be able to find a place for this. Rona's Vortex, we talked about that as well. Great cheap spell with a kicker cost of 2 and a black. Just great removal. And then lastly, I think if there's a home for this card, it's going to be in blue-black. It blocks, it has 3 toughness, it's 2 mana, it helps ramp you into your spells. And then this deck has a ton of kicker stuff as well, so it's going to help you cast those kick spells. Up next, this is going to be the Spells Matter deck. This is going to be aggressive, tempo-based. I think this is going to be one of the better decks in the format. And we talked about some of the great uncommons like Electrostatic Infantry, which is going to be at its best in this deck. There's also some great signpost uncommons. I think Najal is pretty good, but 5 mana for a 5/4 is not great stats. And it looks like it has haste. It does not. But it does give your sorcery spells flash, and that is a powerful effect. There are quite a few strong sorcery speed spells in this format that you can cast with flash that's really going to come out of nowhere and surprise your opponent. In addition, you can pay 2 to copy those spells when this thing attacks. So if you tap, attack, you can cast a sorcery spell, remove your opponent's whatever, copy it. That gets 2 blockers out of the way, and all of a sudden you're swinging in with a 5/4. You copied your spell. This card can be a house in those types of situations. And then last here for the signpost uncommons, I think is the premier signpost uncommon for archetypes. I think Balmor is completely busted. It's 2 mana for a 1/3 flyer. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control get +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. In this deck, you're often casting multiple spells in a turn that are cheap. And so this can just enable huge attacks across the board with evasion, and it's a must-kill threat for your opponent whenever you play this card, and it's cheap. It's only 2 mana. All right, some of the synergy pieces, and there's really, really good ones here. So Timely Interference looks unassuming. It's a single blue mana with a kicker of 1 and a red. Target creature, it's instant. Target creature is -1/-0 until end of turn. If it's kicked, that creature blocks this turn if able, and then you draw a card. So this can be 2-for-1 removal spell. So all you need is a creature that's bigger than theirs. You can go kill their creature, force it to block, and draw a card for the low, low price of 3 mana at instant speed. Up next, I think this one is going to mainly have a home in the blue-red spells deck. But that's why we wanted to highlight these synergy pieces, because you might see this one wheeling. So Twin Inferno is 2 mana for an instant. You can copy your next spell or give a creature double strike. Because of how tempo-based and powerful this deck, and explosive this deck can be, I think there's validity in both of those modes. So I think it's going to be very strong. And then last up, I don't think other people are going to want this as well. So Haunting Figment looks very unassuming. It's a 2/1 Vigilance for 2. Vigilance being kind of a weird keyword that we usually don't see in blue, but here we are. It's unblockable if you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. So a 2/1 unblockable Vigilance is pretty good. And since you're going to be casting spells most turns, I think this card has a place. It also hangs back to block. So if it's not unblockable, it's very annoying on defense for your opponent. Just a very annoying card that I think you're going to be able to pick up late. I think you're going to be able to pick up all 3 of these cards late. But the deck itself is also full of very premium commons and uncommons. All right. This is the big Simic splashy deck. This is going to be big domain. So Territorial Morrow is going to be good in this deck. 5 mana, star, its power and toughness are equal to twice the number of basic land types among lands you control. I think often in this deck it will be a 6/6, 8/8, or even a 10/10 sometimes, but it's 6/6 or an 8/8. The signposts and commons I'm not as impressed with. Tatiova certainly is powerful late game if it survives. 3 mana for a 3/3 is fine. Land creatures you control have flying, and then whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, up to 1 land you control becomes a 3/3 haste. Of course, it would also have flying. So this only starts at 7, so lands 7, 8, 9, 10, those are going to become 3/3 flying hastes. Not all of your other lands are going to do that. That would be too broken. But if you can get there, seems like a decent payoff. And then next up, Nail Avazoa Aeronaut. Wow. Word soup. 4 mana for 2/4 flying, which is medium stats. It does avoid Lightning Strike. Domain, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, so you have to get in with it. Look at the top X, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. And then put one of them on top, so you don't get to draw it. It's not quite as good as Scry, because you have to put the rest on the bottom in a random order. You don't get to decide. You don't get to 2 top or 3 top. If you control 5 basic land types, you get to draw a card. Then it becomes decent, because you get to look at the top 5 and draw one of them. You do have to still put the other 4 on the bottom, but then it becomes pretty good. The problem is just going to be getting to 5 basic land types, which is when this card becomes pretty good. Some of the synergy pieces, I really like the Weatherseed Treaty in this, especially with Territorial Morrow. I think this card is bananas. 3 mana, search your library for a basic land card. Put it into play tap. So it's slightly more expensive Rampant Growth. But on step 2, you get a 1/1 Saproling token, so you're already fine there with that. A 3 mana 1/1 that goes and grabs you a land is cool. And then the third chapter is Domain. Target creature you control gets +X/+X and trample until end of turn. So putting that on your Morrow, which would then be at least a 6/6, right? Because we're splashing here. It would make it a 9/9 trample swinging in. So that's pretty good on turn 5. We also have Joint Exploration. I like this card as well. I think this card's kind of fun. 2 mana with a kicker of 1. Scry 2, draw a card at its base. And then if it was kicked, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So that's really strong. You can get to ambush an opponent with Domain here because it's instant speed and buff your Morrow or whatever other Domain creatures you have. Get some extra payoffs. And then last up, we have Pixie Illusionist. I think this card is actually going to be key for this deck, and no one else is going to want it. So it's 1 mana for a 1/1 flyer. You can kick it for 3 and a green. If it's kicked, it becomes a 3/3 flyer, which is good. And then you can tap it to turn a land you control into the basic land type of your choice until end of turn. So that also enables your Domain whenever you can tap this thing. All right, up next we have Rakdos. This is Steal and Sack and Attack. Are we surprised? No. But we do get functional reprint of Grab the Reins, one of the best Steal, Sack, and Attack cards made. So it's 3 mana to steal something. But if you kick it, you automatically get the sacrifice part of it there. You don't know assembly required. If you can kick this thing, it's 7 mana. That's a lot. I get it. It's still going to come up. But Enthralled of the Pit, I do think has a place in this deck because there's good sack outlets. Garna, Bloodfist of Keld. So this is going to be more on that attack and die, or attack and sack part, not necessarily the steal. 4/3 for 4, dies to Lightning Strike. I keep saying that. But whenever another creature you control dies, draw a card if it was attacking. So it encourages you to trade off. Otherwise, if it wasn't attacking, if you just sack it, Garna deals 1 damage to each opponent, starts pinging them. Card seems fine, not great, but I really like this next one. Lagomos, Hand of Hatred, I think is incredibly powerful. 3 mana for a 1/3. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you get a 2/1 red elemental token with trample and haste, and then you sack it end of turn. So this automatically enables any sort of sacrifice stuff you have, plus every turn you get to beat in with a 2/1. And sometimes your opponent just can't handle that. It works great with Pump. Of course, other sacrifice outlets. You just throw your crap at the opponent over and over again, and they have to deal with Lagomos at some point. The second ability, you're just really never going to use. So you can just ignore the tap, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, activate only if 5 or more creatures died this turn. That usually doesn't happen. If it does, I mean, sweet. That's good for you. And go for it. But I think the first ability of Lagomos is what makes it very, very strong. All right, synergy pieces. So we have Hunter Cyclops here. Allows you, when you steal something or whatever you're doing, sacrifice one of your 2/1 little elemental tokens, deals 1 damage to any target. Not great stats, 5 mana for a 5/4, but it can get in there. And maybe you can clear the way by using its sacrifice ability to clear the way for it. It also allows, if you have sack fodder for your creatures, to trade up just by having threat of activation here. Bone Splinters is back. Love this card in this deck. So steal and Bone Splinter something is good. Great, works great with Lagomos. But you sack a creature to destroy a creature. Very cheap removal. And then lastly, we talked about Balduvian Atrocity. I think, of course, it's at its best in Rakdos. But you can use this, kick it, get your card back, and then sack it with Bone Splinters or Hurler Cyclops to get some additional value. All right. Up next, we have Golgari. Graveyard Recursion. Are we surprised? A lot of classic format archetype comebacks here for Dominaria. Urborg Repossession, I think, is going to be a pretty strong card. It's a raised dead that gains your life, which is fine already. You can kick it for 1 and a green to make it soul salvage, essentially, with some upside. It allows you to get back any permanent, the second permanent from your graveyard to your hand as well. First has to be a creature. So very flexible, good card, gains you some life, adds some sustain, works with your yard, which Golgari wants to do, is put things into the yard, self-mill, that type of stuff. The Signpost uncommons are a little bit confusing. Bortuk Bone Rattle, 6 mana, 4/4, not great stats. It has domain, as everything green wants is domain. And if you cast it, you can bring back a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield, not your hand, to the battlefield, which is very strong, but it's restricted by mana value less than or equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control. So you can only get a 2-drop if you only have forests and swamps in play. It can be up to a 5-drop, of course, which is very strong. But if you're splashing here with the green domain side, maybe a 3-drop, which is still pretty good. And lastly, Urg Spawn of Turg. I don't know about this card. It's 2 black and a green, and its power is equal to the number of land cards in your graveyard. It does have a big butt, which is cool. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you can surveil, put a land into the yard, but that takes you maybe off domain, unless it's, if it's your splash land or something. And then you can sack lands to gain 2 life, but you got to pay 2 mana for it. Not really sure what's going on here. Maybe it has applications, but I'll hold out judgment on that. Not going to be first pick in this one. All right, Eerie Soul Tender, I think, is at home here. So it's a 3 mana 3/1. It does self mill, which is what you want to do. And then you can pay 5, exile it, and get another creature card from your graveyard to grave dig another creature back out. So it can trade off, get a creature back in the late game, and then it self mills. I think this is at home in green. It is kind of clunky. It cannot really attack in very well because of all the 1/1 tokens running around, but it is decent on defense. Writhing Necromancer. So in green-black would be the deck that can cast this for cheap. Death Touch isn't great on a 5/5 because it pretty much kills anything it goes into combat with anyway. But it does make it so it can kill, so it can't be double blocked profitably by a couple 3/3s, which is it's a fair upside. It is kind of clunky, but I think in this deck, if you can get this to be 4 or 5 mana, or even 3 mana, it's pretty strong. And then lastly, Shadow Prophecy. I think this card might also have a home in blue-black. There's just really not a lot of ways to get instants or sorceries back in blue-black. So I think this is going to be better in green where you have more of that domain. 3 mana instant speed. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types you control. 2 into your hand, rest into the yard, you lose 2 life. So if you're splashing and you have 4 land types in play, you look at the top 4, pick the best 2, the other 2 go into the yard, and then you can presumably get some value for them later. You do lose 2 life, and this deck seems a little bit slower, so that can be an issue, but it is 3 mana. It's usually a mana. This is a mana cheaper than we usually see this effect for. All right, last up we have Gruul. So I do like this deck. I think this is going to be a strong little beatdown mid-range deck led by cards like Nishoba Brawler. We've talked about this one, 2 mana beatdown creature at its home in red-green, I think. It can be very strong once you get it to 3 power or more. The Signpost uncommons like Rada. I think this card also has a place in a home here. Works best, of course, with enlist creatures. There's a few good uncommon enlist creatures in red and green that you can use this for. Whenever it becomes tapped, another target creature you control gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types you can among lands you can control. So one of the faults of the enlist creatures and enlisting is that it doesn't buff toughness. But if you're tapping Rada, you can give that creature +2/+2 or +3/+3 in addition to the enlist bonus from Rada. So it gets +6/+3 or +5/+2, which is pretty insane if you can enlist with this card out. And then Rulik Mon's Warren Chief. We'll have to see. This is double green. I envision green being more of a support color here. So it might be tough to cast. It's a 3/3 menace, which is fine. Whenever it attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's land, put it onto the battlefield tapped. You didn't put it on a card onto the battlefield this way. You create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. Now, even if it is a land, you may put it into play. So you still get the option there, but of course you'll probably want to ramp that bad boy out, especially if it gives you extra domain, which is kind of what this deck wants to do. All right, some of the synergy pieces. We talked about Yavimaya Iconoclast. This is here just because it's really, really good, and it beats down really, really well. No domain, don't worry about it. Just a very strong card. Sprouting Goblin, I think, is going to be strong in this. It's a grizzly bear on its face with minor upside. You can tap, sack a land, draw a card late game. But if you kick it, you can search your land search your library for a land, put it into your hand, then shuffle so it can help find your splash color or your dual, not your dual land, but your off color, or get you another land to hit your land drops, right? If you're stuck on 3 land or something. And then lastly, I think Molten Monstrosity, this is where it's going to find its home. You can pick this one up late, I think. 5/5 Trampler for 8, unplayable, but knowing that you're going to be beating down with 3-4 power creatures makes this thing pretty cheap. A 5/5 Trampler for 4 or 5 mana is pretty good. All right, that's going to do it for me. Those are the archetypes cards, top commons. Really excited for this set. Glad to be moving on from the SNC, HBG era into a new set that looks like a lot of fun. All right, have a good one.